Thank you to our judges for being here with us today. Shelley Lucas-Witch from CPA Saskatchewan, Kate Lockhart from MCO, Nick Kochar from Refresh, Alana Coach from the Government of Saskatchewan, Kim McConnell from AdFarm, Michael Hoffert from Farm Credit Canada, Tiffany Stevenson from the Ministry of Agriculture, and Mohammed Tourshizi from the Department of Bioresource Policy, Business and Economics, and the College of Agriculture and Bioresources. Competitors will have a maximum of 20 minutes to present. Immediately following the presentation, judges will have a total of 5 minutes to ask the presenters questions. The volunteer timekeeper will show time cards at various intervals to indicate the remaining time and will stop any speaker who exceeds the maximum time limit. No questions, comments, cell phones, or picture taking will be permitted from the audience at any given time. The audience will only be permitted to applaud following the question and answer period. The audience is also banned from any materials that bear the name or symbol of a competing university. And we also ask that the audience exit the room immediately following the question and answer period. Here's me begin when you're ready.
Real prairie beef. We know that this is what sets the Ministry of Agriculture apart from any other competitor in the food and services industry. We know that recently A&W and Chipotle have been threatening that image of what real prairie beef really means. But we know they're only threatening you because of their distribution strategy and their content creation strategy. So today we're going to tell you exactly how we're going to create a campaign around real prairie beef so that it actually relates and resonates with the millennial audience of today. So thank you so much for having us today. We're our Copacetic Consulting. My name is Rosa with my colleagues here, Ashley and Mira, and we're really excited to be here today because we believe in real prairie beef, and we believe that we can make a difference in today's millennials' lives with what that means to them and how it's going to react to them. So let's talk about first what you asked us to do. So you asked us, Mr. Hilsner, how can we engage and educate Saskatchewan's millennials in order to build trust in the beef industry? Well, today we identified the first primary issue of being that there's misconceptions of this industry. Of course, we mentioned that A&W and Chipotle have already painted a negative industry of it, and today we're going to tell you how we're going to address that. The secondary issue that's also important to look at is that the current message of how you talk about the beef industry is misaligned with your new target audience of these millennials. So we need to make sure that we reach them in the right places where they're prominent. So our recommendation of this campaign called Real Prairie Beef comprises of 3 main things. The first is strategic digital content that we'll dive into more later in our presentation. The second is to have farm-to-table events to really connect them to the local farmers in Saskatchewan. And the third is to have an introduction of a prairie beef certification that we'll dive into later. So over the span of 1 year, we're going to help you to achieve excellence with the Real Prairie Beef campaign. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Ashley, who's going to dive into the analysis for you.
Thank you, Rosa. So before I begin, what I'd like to highlight in this analysis is that we're going to dive into these issues into more detail, but also to really understand the business situation, what we need to do is identify opportunities, and our recommendation will capitalize on these opportunities. So let's begin. The first issue that Rosa identified is that there's a misconception of the industry. There's a cognitive bias associated with meat and products in the agricultural industry that has hormones in it. But we know that your food tastes just as good, it's just as safe, and it's actually more cost efficient and resource efficient. And so with this proliferation of misinformation, we've seen statistics that show that just about half of Canadians are not confident with the safety of food. And so we need to change that perception. And as Rosa mentioned, we were here today to really deliver two campaigns. One, to talk about the industry, and second, to talk about employment. But with further analysis, what we actually realized is that these two campaigns are going to be sequential. What we need to do first is drive education and awareness before we can drive that interest in the employment industry. And that's what we'll be focusing on today. Second, Rosa also mentioned that A&W and Chipotle, two of your competitors, have actually also painted a negative image of the beef industry. What A&W has done is created a digital campaign that really resonates with millennials. And how they've done this is really featured real people. They're engaging and interactive, and they're experiential. And they've also been distributed on channels where millennials are. And this is what we'll need to do going forward. When we're looking at the information that you've provided, it's got great information. It's really dense, and it's got a lot of scientific facts. But what we realize is that it's passive and text heavy. A lot of millennials are spending less time because they're just so busy with different things, and they want to experience life. And so we've also noticed that it's not on the right channels, and this is what we'll help fix today. What we need to do is leverage what A&W was able to accomplish through the digital strategy going forward. The second issue that Rosa brought up was that the current message is misaligned with your target market. Your target audience, as you mentioned, are millennials. When we did some market analysis, we realized that this market is comprised of 210,000 millennials between the ages of 18 to 30. We know that on average, Canadians are consuming about 250 videos online per month. That's a lot of digital content. We also know that they're spending about 4 hours a day online, and 20% of their online consumption is actually on mobile devices. So they're mobile, they're moving around, and they don't have a lot of time. There's a trend towards more focused on micro moments, where we're really engaging and creating an experience for people to engage with, rather than posting passive content. And this is what trend that we see going forward. We also know that 24% of consumers, Canadian consumers, are actively engaging with user-generated content and word-of-mouth data. So this is going to be crucial to leverage going forward. With sharing ideas, we need millennials to really be engaged on the right channels and really attribute to this to our distribution strategy and to to become champions for the agricultural industry. So what do we know about our target market? You've mentioned that you want to focus on 18 to 30-year-olds who are millennials in Saskatchewan. We know that they care about experiences, they really are conducive to community values, and really care about connecting with each other. And that's going to be paramount going forward. We also know that they care about locally produced products and sustainable sourcing. We also know that they have shorter attention spans. So using mobile is going to be key to interact with these individuals. But what are the benefits of digital? We know this is a fairly new medium, and let me just break down the benefits for you today. So we know that it's cost effective. We know that you can measure the impact of what you're putting out there, and that's really, really important when you're looking at engagement. We also know that it's not limited to geographic barriers. Not being in Saskatchewan does not limit you from being able to engage with our content and really experience it for yourselves, and that's going to be crucial as well. We also know that it allows for real, raw micro moments where you're actually experiencing and engaging with content. And it allows for the proliferation of information, and this is going to be paramount. So one analogy I like to use is if content is king, distribution is King Kong. And what that means is that you can have great content, you can have informative content, but if it's not produced in the right way, and it's not distributed in the right way, it doesn't have the impact that it could really potentially maximize. And that's what our recommendation is going to look at today.
Thanks very much, Ashley. So before we dive into the recommendation, I just want to iterate again. I know that with regards to asking us today, you talked about having both a focus on driving the awareness with the consumers as well as having the potential of the job market. We already discussed in our analysis that today we're going to focus primarily on driving the awareness because of time, but also because we really dive really deep into the meat and bones of what that looks like. So without further ado, let's talk about the alternatives and how we got to our recommendation. So first of all, we want to make sure we understand what's important to the Ministry of Agriculture. The first is that it improves your brand reputation because essentially it is a brand that you're going to be marketing to these millennials. We also want to make sure that it's engaging with these new millennials and this new target market of yours, and that it develops a strong brand message that can resonate in the long term for future campaigns as well. So when we looked at the first thing that we had to think about, it was what is our key message? We know there's so many different value propositions when it comes to selling beef or marketing beef, and we want to look at three main things. Do we look at the fact that it's hormone beef and talking about the benefits of why they're hormones, so really having that for, against, and going against A&W and Chipotle? Or are we looking at the fact that it's local prairie beef? The fact that it's the local farmers in Saskatchewan that are raising these cattle for the Canadian families? Or we're looking at a more broader scheme, that is the high quality Canadian beef that sets us apart from the rest of the world. we decided, of course, that it's the local prairie beef that we want to focus on because we believe it's that connection to the local farmer, in addition to knowing where your food comes from, that's going to be really impactful for today's millennials. And especially as we dive into digital and how that communicates in that platform and in that space, that's going to really make an impact with those millennials. So keeping this in mind, focusing on real prairie beef, we're going to look at what marketing tactics work best. So we put your 3 decision criteria: improving brand reputation, engaging with the new millennials, and developing a strong brand message as our criteria at the very top. And then we looked at these 3 alternatives for what tactics make sense. So we looked at having an online contest campaign. We know that with social, everything's really popular nowadays. You can easily enter competitions through Twitter with a hashtag specific and then look at the entries there and decide who wins. We also looked at earned media channels and content. So rather than having just boosted posts on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, actually creating content that will drive an organic reach and have really high impact shareable content. Or are we looking at an influencer or brand strategy? Do we need someone to be on not only in digital but also in person to champion what it means to believe in real prairie beef? So when we looked at these alternatives, we assessed them based on those metrics, and we genuinely believe that it's really this earned media channel and content strategy that's going to take you to the next level and to help you to achieve excellence. And this is because millennials will really care about word-of-mouth marketing and what their friends are sharing. So if we focus your content strategy on ways to make shareable, buzzworthy content that's exciting, we're going to ensure that it's going to really reach those millennial audiences, and it's going to resonate with them and make an impact. So without further ado, we're going to dive right into our exciting recommendation, which, of course, as we shared in the beginning, is real prairie beef. Well, what does that look like? There's really 3 main components that we talked about in the beginning. First is that there's digital content, and digital content that, again, emphasizes the impact of earned media. The second is to have farm-to-table events, because even though we are championing a digital strategy for recommendation, we realize that you need to meet the farmers in person to really resonate with them and connect with them. We also know that it's important to identify your beef as different than anyone else, so we want to introduce a prairie beef certification, and I'll go into details in just a bit. But the priority today, we're going to focus on building a positive brand association with prairie beef by creating engaging micro-moment contents that Ashley mentioned earlier through our digital content and unique events. So we'll talk a little bit about prairie beef, where we're going to focus mostly on the digital content and the farm-to-table event, mostly because of timing. So the first is this digital content piece. I know you guys are really excited to hear about this, and I'm just as excited to share it with you. So of course we want to educate millennials about in terms of where it matters most. So there is a difference between paid and earned media that I went over earlier, and we again want to focus on joining that earned media content. So what we can do is, instead of just focusing on content that's more advertorial, really think about what engages them. Look at YouTube videos that either have a challenge or have some sort of aspect to them, like the ALS challenge, or whether it's some sort of DIY. Look at content that really engages with millennials today and make it buzzworthy and shareworthy by getting them there. We also want to create this video series of shorter clips because we know that today micro moments are really important. We are short for time in terms of our attention spans, in addition to we're always on the go. So when we're looking at mobile, content needs to be shorter and much more robust. So we recommend 3 15 to 30 second long videos, and we want to focus on 3 main things. The first, to educate youth in terms of where the beef is raised, right here in your home in Saskatchewan. The second is to show the benefits of supporting local farmers and prairie beef. And the third is to show the innovations in the beef industry. There's this misconception that tractors are really the only thing that are related to agriculture, but that's not the case anymore. There's drones involved, there's so much more technology that's making this industry so savvy. We want to get millennials excited about that. So we also want to make sure that we communicate to you how to distribute this content. So once you develop this wonderful, exciting video series, we want to make sure that you put it in the right places, because we talked about we want you to achieve that King Kong status. So we recommend 2 things. First is sponsored content. And sponsored content is looking at specifically at publications where millennials are reading their news. They're not looking at global news, they're not looking at CTV. The ones that are dominating today are ones like BuzzFeed Canada, Huffington Post, Vice, Hypebeast. This is where you need to communicate to the millennials what's different about prairie beef compared to other food sources. We also want to do a little bit of paid media, but mostly earn media on boosted channels such as YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. And we also recommend an important part of the strategy is to test and boost your best performing content and then amplify it further with the rest of your budget. And Mira will go into that later on in just your implementation. So that wraps up our digital content piece. We're going to dive now into our farm-to-table event. And this is the second exciting part of our recommendation with the Real Prairie Beef campaign. So we talked about how you also need to make an in-person connection and not just make it online and digital for these millennials. So what we introduced is to build a personal connection with millennials with their local farmers. So we want to see 4 long table dinners at local farms every year, and we recommend that you use our RSV clients to find the right family farms to host these events at and make it feel authentic, warm, inviting, just as if it was your own home. We also want to see approximately 50 attendees from your target market attending these events, in addition to special guests such as restaurant entrepreneurs, food specialists, agricultural specialists, as well as any other sponsors to just add more impact to the event for the millennials overall. We also want to allow the dinner conversations to revolve around local farming practices and local food, and really generating that awareness and education of what it means to have real prairie beef. And finally, we want to make sure that you have yourself set up for success to achieve excellence, so we're recommending to hire a contract event planner for this recommendation. And with the last part of our recommendation, I'm not going to go over this in detail because I want you to get to the juicy parts in implementation. We just want to talk about the prairie beef certification. So we want to elevate the perception of what prairie beef is through a product certification. So we want to help consumers recognize that prairie beef is different and that it's better quality, and it has so many reasons to really look for it and purchase it in stores as well as in restaurants. So it's very similar to British Columbia's Ocean Wise campaign. With the Ocean Wise campaign, it's a joint participation with the local aquarium in Vancouver, and anywhere restaurants or grocery stores show the Ocean Wise logo, you know that it's farmed in sustainable and healthy practices and that the fish are treated humanely. In the same way, we want to show that real prairie beef doesn't mean that we're taking the cheap route. We are actually putting quality, commitment, and time into making sure that we raise the right cattle for Canadian families. So we want to associate this with, as we mentioned, the prairie-style cattle raising, and in the long term, this certification could be developed into a program where you share recipes online and build upon other campaigns to engage consumers even further. So that wraps up our recommendation, and I'll pass it on to my colleague Mira, who will talk about how we're going to roll this out.
Ms. Rosa. So Rosa went over our recommendation that's supposed to help you achieve excellence. But what exactly does that mean? For us, that's these 3 pillars: technology, connections that set you up to be prosperous. Our recommendation leverages paid and earned media through digitally based distribution, builds connections by connecting millennials through both interactive and experiential moments, which is those long table, big, huge dinner events that they can go to and experience and share with their friends. And lastly, you achieve prosperity through our goal of reaching 63,000 of those millennials that are in that target market that Ashley assessed and sized earlier. So going into the implementation, first and foremost, you want to know how much this is going to cost and what you should take to the Ministry of Agriculture for the budget. Based on these costs outlined above, the total cost will be $380,000, and we recognize that as an agency you need to make money as well. So we recommended a $50,000 retainer for yourself, so this will reach a total of $430,000. When you break it down to a more base level, the cost per person reached is only $6.83 for those 63,000 people reached, so it's well worth the investment. In the short term, so in this next 6 weeks, what are you going to be doing? There's 4 key steps. In terms to the real prairie beef brand, you'll be contacting a designer to develop that logo, as well as beginning to work with those producers who do the packaging to implement the logo in long term, which will be happening at the end of 2016. Right? You also need to assess your content creation capabilities. This is something that's extremely important, as with our recommendation, content is king, and assess whether or not it can meet these leverages. And if not, you'll be able to use that $200,000 to outsource to a content creation agency who will be able to help you with the implementation. We also need to identify the sources for the log table event. So that's those 5 families you can do through your current client base, as well as secure those table hosts. So you yourself, Peter, will be the lead strategist in this, as well as working, of course, with your client. The key KPIs, it's a relatively short implementation, is that the RFP, if you decide to go with a content agency, needs to be decided by the end of February, as well as you need to secure those farm posts in this time. So our medium term, which is March to July, is when a lot of the preparation happens. However, this is also when you're beginning to launch that sponsored content. So that's when you're beginning to put those promotion articles that's describing the industry across those different channels that Rosa described. As well as you'll be beginning to create those videos, those information quick short videos that'll reach those millennials in the time. We recommend, the long table event should be beginning in April and June for those first two for the next short term. As well as your key KPI is that your total impression for this period will be 20,000. In the long term, so August onwards, you'll be hosting another 2 long table events. The key KPIs is that you'll actually be using the content created at those long table events so they get there. It's an amazing setup. Of course, we're social beings, so we want to take a picture and share with all of our friends and make them jealous and wish that they could be there with all of these, with the athletes using it and the people who are there with you. So we'll be utilizing the UGC created at those events in our social and boosting it on those programs, on our channels. The agency, if you recommended with the retaining, will be the agency of record, so you'll be implementing the social content for this campaign, as well as continue working with RSP for the accreditation rollout. And your total reach in the long term, which is 30% of the target market of Saskatchewan, of those millennials, will be 63,000 visitors. We've identified 3 key risks and incorporated this into our recommendation so that we can mitigate it in a proactive way, as opposed to waiting for it to happen and being reactive with a contingency. First is that the content doesn't have a wide enough reach. Well, that's why we chose to do digital, that you can do the amplified posts. Second is that there's just a disinterested target market, as this is an issue. Our mitigation is that it's on relevant channels and the content's going to be interesting. And lastly, that there's negative backlash from animal cruelty groups who are against farming in general. And for that, we recommend the community management and the community managers who will be trained in responding to those type of comments to mitigate any negative feedback.
So today you asked us, how can we engage today's millennials in Saskatchewan in order to build trust in the beef industry? With our recommendation of the Real Prairie Beef Strategy, we're going to help you to achieve excellence. Thank you so much for your time today. We'll now open the floor to any questions that you have.
I have a question. You said you plan that will reach 63,000 of the total 220,000 target market. How does that benchmark against other ad campaigns? Is that percentage good, bad, average?
Yeah, that's a great question that you asked. We know that with A&W's campaign, they actually reached a similar benchmark. So we know that they reached about 25 to 30%. So that being the case, we made that your benchmark for success in this particular campaign.
But that was given a huge advertising budget, et cetera. Is that same benchmark realistic given our limited budget and resources?
We believe that it is very realistic because the culture of Saskatchewan is very community-based. It's about making connections and really fostering a sense of community. So we believe that the sharing and engagement rate amongst this pool of 200,000 target market will be very realistic.
So the program itself is driven a lot by online, driving people through into their websites and to watch these great views on the long table. Tell us a little bit more about that in terms of how you decided on, is that your key part versus maybe a campaign on campus across the province?
Sure. So the reason why we went with a long table event is that it brings people, it makes it real for them, it brings them to the farms, as well as it's a different event that you want to share. I talked about the exclusivity of it. I want my friends to be jealous that I'm there. So that really leverages the organic reach that you'll get from it. So that's why we went with that approach, as well as it's more engaging than a one-way communication advertising campaign that perhaps you described.
You're confident that Huffington will be able to leverage that cool idea to then get it over to the masses?
We know that based on our research with how A&W does their content as well, that publications like BuzzFeed and Huffington Post are always looking for juicy new content. And we know that we haven't heard at least of anything done like this before with farmers in Saskatchewan. So we know this is going to be a really pivotal new piece of content for them to share on their news channels.
How will the Real Prairie Beef campaign overcome the confusion from competitive campaigns such as the Alberta Beef campaign or McDonald's Verified Sustainable Beef campaign?
So we did see that those are other campaigns that are overarching, and that is why we chose to include the Prairie aspect of it, so that you understand that there's geographical reach. It's not just getting the beef from Saskatchewan, but also Alberta. So it is promoting a greater awareness, and through this strategy, which is different perhaps than the other strategies that are implemented by those companies, that's how we'll differentiate.
Can you tell me how dealing with the misconceptions of the industry are actually going to drive employment? Because at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about this driving employment into agriculture. So can you tell me how this campaign will do that?
So just to clarify, we know that you were asking for 2 different campaigns, and what we realized was these campaigns will actually have to be sequential. What we want to do is really build interest to really advertise or to really promote that the agriculture industry doesn't have all these misconceptions, and they are misconceptions based off of competitors such as A&W and Chipotle. And from that, we're going to generate interest and then promote employment from there.
As well, just wanted to add to Ashley's great point that especially with our long table or farm to table event, we mentioned that we want special guests such as farmers as well as local foodies to really talk about what it means to have real prairie beef. So we think that's also a great opportunity to have conversations about future employment opportunities and then to dive into the next campaign in the next segment after.
Just on those farm to table, how do you select your guests to ensure that that message really does get the needed buzz following it? Because if we just selected a group of 18 to 30-year-olds, they're not necessarily really the right group. So how do you make sure that you really got that buzz generated?
Sure. So with that, we wanted to choose approximately, of those 50 people, have 15 of them be those influencers I'm talking about. So specialists, we know that the music team is very popular here, so musicians, that would be interesting to those millennials, and then open the rest of the seating to the average consumer. So that's how we'll get the reach with those influencers, and by creating demand for people who want to create it, share it on their social channels.
And specifically, we're going to target the event on Facebook, so add money behind that, boost it to the right audience, in addition to also having an Eventbrite page that we'll talk about in terms of communicating in your social media channels. So there's different ways in terms of distributing that message and communicating and promoting that event to the right audience.
So just a quick question here. If content is king, distribution is king Kong, that's a double-edged sword in the sense that if that message is not particularly strong, it becomes a major, colossal risk to telling the whole world that your message is not effective, or you're not portraying what it is you want to see. Why should the target market believe you?
So with that risk of content, essentially what you're saying, that it might not be strong enough, that is why I recommended that you go, if you don't have the capability within your agency for content creation, with another agency, because they specialize in that. We know you have the stats and the information, but they make it relevant and interesting, written in a whimsical way for those consumers. So that's how we will be doing that.
Do you have an opinion on what that message might be?
With regards to specifically the
sentence.
millennials,
Your position in a sentence. One unified message. What would that be?
we would say that real prairie beef means focusing on home, focusing on the local farmers and focusing on understanding where your food comes from, and we really think that's going to be the driver of success.
Okay, that's all we have time for.